And have you seen an effect on perhaps the number of buyers from all over the country and the EU not perhaps, or being reluctant to take part in those fish auctions now?
Well, I think obviously, if it's fish auctions in the in the European Union, then one of the things we've tried to target is an exporter who might have had an order for a particular time slot with a particular customer. If something went wrong and they missed that order, they might end up having to just return the fish onto the open market and accept a lower price. And certainly, I think it was less the case that you'd have, lorry loads of fish that were rotting, which was a sort of caricature that was sort of presented. Much more that there could have been some consignments where they got a lower value for the fish than they had hoped. And so the way we designed the scheme helped those exporters who were caught in that position.
My point is, there are auction houses who, if the fish is sold for a reduced price, they get less commission, but they still have to provide staff and ice and everything to support the catch. Did you not think about supporting them in any way?
I think what I'd say is when you do support schemes, as we've all seen with the various suites of schemes that the government's done on coronavirus, none of these schemes can be perfect. None of them can be perfectly fair. You have to design them in a way that's deliverable and can be implemented and has as much simplicity as possible, so that you can actually get the money out along objective criteria. And what inevitably happens is, when you announce a scheme, there will be people who say, well, I've been missed, or I don't quite fit the criteria. And the trouble is, the more you complicate schemes to try to accommodate these people, the less deliverable it becomes. So we were very clear on the fisheries disruption scheme that it was to help fishermen or help exporters with a verifiable loss that they might have had through trying to export, rather than a sort of opportunity cost, as it were.
Thank you. And if I could just turn to meat now, could you please explain why there isn't an equivalent scheme to support meat exporters?
Well, we've seen fewer issues on the meat sector. I think what's made it uniquely difficult on fisheries is really the fact that you've often, particularly in the shellfish sector, you're getting smaller consignments. It's more perishable, often going to individual retailers, and that's what's caused the particular challenges that they've had. When it comes to meat exports, we've had fewer issues. There have been some, one or two issues with pork exports to the Netherlands surrounding the trichinella test. But generally speaking, although meat processors have obviously not welcomed the additional paperwork, they've managed it far better, in that you tend to get a lorry load of lamb carcasses that will go to a packer somewhere in the EU. It's a single consignment, often to a single customer. It's less complicated all round, and they've tended to adjust to it quite quickly. So we've not really seen the same sorts of issues in the meat processing sector.
I'll just give you a figure there to back that up. So we have signed 40, I think we vets have signed 40,000 export health certificates since January the 1st for exports to the EU. About 50 trucks have been stuck at the border over that period, and we work actively to get those through, to get the issues resolved. 3/4 of those 50 got through following our action, working with authorities on the continent. There's about 15 that were turned back, but that's 15 out of 40,000 issued.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, and Mr. Kennedy. Thank you very much, Chairman. That's me done.
Thank you, Cheryl, very much. Right.
On this question.
That's right. Yes, but you'll come one or two others. Geraint, are you still there? Are you coming on?
I'm here, Chair. You'll be glad to hear.
On, please. Yeah.
I'll be brisk. Secretary of State, and obviously these changes and the red tape involved in the new non-tariff barriers and all the documentation has hit small businesses much harder than bigger businesses. And of course, I know you've been blaming the EU throughout this hearing, but obviously it was Britain who decided to leave the EU. They didn't ask us to leave. So will you be providing more support for smaller businesses who haven't got the resources that bigger ones have?
Well, we've had so specific schemes, obviously for our for trade with Northern Ireland. So some of those smaller businesses would benefit from the movement assistance service, where we cover the costs of export health certificates and phytosanitary certificates in the case, for instance, of an ornamental plant nursery selling plants to a garden centre in Northern Ireland. We have also then had some generic support schemes specifically for small businesses to help them to prepare. So there has been support for them to prepare and get ready for this. I don't know whether David
can I ask you on the point you've made. Are you planning to sort of replicate the trader support scheme and the movement assistance scheme for seafood and meat exports to the EU overall, as opposed to just Northern Ireland?
No, this is a very specific provision, for Northern Ireland, because obviously Northern Ireland is not an export market; it's part of the United Kingdom, and it's because of the Northern Ireland Protocol that we've got particular provisions that we have to follow by way of SPS checks on some goods going in, and those are the costs that we're covering. So there's a difference in that one is a domestic trade within the United Kingdom, the other is an export trade, and there would be problems, I think, under WTO rules if you were to subsidise or help people with the documentation for exporting to the EU market, but not for exporting to other third countries around the world.
All right, so it's the WTO is stopping us helping smaller businesses from possibly going bust because of the overheads of red tape we've had from Brexiting. Is that it?
No, I think what you have to say is that, what is the logic for supporting a business that exports to the European Union, but not supporting one that exports to South Korea, Japan, India, or United States, or any other market in the world? So it's really a question of consistency. We do export globally. Businesses do export globally. It's understood that there's a cost through doing that, through things like export health certificates and customs declarations. And it wouldn't really be fair to have a special scheme just for one part of the global market.
But if the vast majority of our fish are sold to the EU, then there will be a case to do it and also just provide it generally, because the cost of doing it elsewhere would be much less because we don't export much. I know there's all this talk about how we're going to somehow sell fresh fish hundreds and hundreds of miles away. I can't imagine how we're going to do that. But I mean, given that a small proportion of our exports are outside the EU, couldn't we just provide support, in particular for small businesses, wherever they sell their fish?
Well, like as I said, we've announced the schemes we've got to basically help those exporters who've got a verifiable loss through the problems in January. But we don't think we can justify having a scheme akin to the one that we have for Northern Ireland, simply because the European Union is obviously a third country, whereas Northern Ireland's part and parcel of the UK, so it's very different.
No, I understand that, but why can't you apply it for every country then? To be consistent with WTO rules and allow people, because some of these businesses are just going to be out of business, aren't they, because of the overheads, and you saying you're just going to write them off?
Well, we're not saying that. What we're saying is, in some cases, there will be a change to trade patterns in that you'll get consolidation of certain goods through wholesalers, through export agents, who will then, in the case of, for instance, cheese, might take several different types of artisan cheese from several different producers, and take a lorry load across and redistribute it from there. So the nature of some trade will change, but as I said earlier, if you look at the trade flows on fisheries, it's getting back up close to where it was anyway. But in some cases, with very small trades, direct, for instance, to individual retailers, well, then there will be probably some changes to business models in future, with some of that trade being consolidated into larger consignments, and that's something that probably needs to happen.
So can I finally ask, and on that, if there's got to be consolidation to have a critical mass, to have the overhead of a business to cover the new costs of red tape, doesn't that mean that it's going to be very difficult for small businesses to enter the market, whether they're fishing boats or small cheese traders, as you were mentioning, because you've got to be of a certain critical mass? And over time, won't that be a problem for us innovating and having new businesses emerging like we'd like them to be?
Well, I'm not sure really that that's the right way to look at it. I mean, it's more that individual small trades will become, obviously harder. Very, very small consignments will become harder because you've got the additional overhead, if you like, of the export health certificate. But bear in mind, we've got lots of small businesses that do trade around the world and do trade with other markets already, and often they will do this with the help of an agent or somebody who will buy a range of goods from a range of suppliers and consolidate it and manage the export process to those to those markets right around the world. So I think there will still be many small businesses that do export, but the model which they use to export in some cases may change, but not all.
And will small businesses in France, for argument's sake, be better off than those in Britain because they've had a longer run-in, a longer transition to, for us to get our paperwork in place and for them to prepare, which will take them into October or next year?
Well, in some ways, yes, because we have taken what we think is a sensible and pragmatic approach to phasing in checks, recognizing that on day one, the regulations that the EU has are in line with British law. So therefore, there is nothing in particular for us to be concerned about from day one. So on a risk-based approach, we've decided that we should phase in checks gradually so that businesses get used to it. And we think that's a pragmatic and sensible thing to do. Obviously, it was open to the EU to reciprocate that. They chose not to for reasons that I think we all understand. They're sort of sticklers for their legal position and their single market. And so they chose not to do that, which obviously it would have been helpful if they had. But nevertheless, I don't think it means we should do necessarily get into a sort of tit for tat kind of approach to these matters. That we should still do the responsible thing and phase in those checks gradually so that people get used to it, and that we phase in the controls that are needed.
So I'd be better off starting off a new fish business in France, even though I'm coming from the UK, than establishing it in Britain.
Well, it would depend if you wanted to export to the UK.
No.
You could, but equally, if you set up a business in France, given that the French fleet have had to forfeit a significant amount of their quota to the UK, and given that we are consulting on potentially requiring vessels to land more of their fish in the UK, you might still need to buy from a UK exporter.
Because I heard that in where I am in Swansea, the EU quota for boats, for big boats, hasn't been used up yet, and there's concern here that more big vessels will be coming up and sort of sucking up all our fish closer to the coast than had happened before we left the EU. Is that not the case?
I don't really see why that would be the case, no, because under the TCA, the EU, as a price for continued access to our waters, are giving up around 25% of the quota that they used to catch in our waters. So they will have less less quota available to them as the price for having some of that continued access.
No, it's just that they're not fishing at quota as a thing, so they've got room to expand. But I suppose they did before, would be your point. I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraint, very much. Right. Okay, so we move on now to talk about veterinary services and that like, and we've got nobody better than Neil Hudson, Dr. Neil Hudson, to deal with it. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And apologies, Secretary of State, I probably sound like a bit of a cracked record, but I declare an interest as a veterinary surgeon. So I'll ask you, forgive me if I ask you a bit about veterinary capacity. We've touched on this earlier in the session about the thoughts about veterinary capacity, whether it is there in place for the certification. And there is the great support of the certification support officers. But really just your thoughts, whether the veterinary capacity is there, and then also have you had any thoughts about looking at the Northern Ireland model of increasing the public veterinary workforce? Because as we know, the OVs, many of them are in companion animal practice or farm animal practice and have other commitments through the course of their working weeks and working days. So have you thought about having increasing the sort of dedicated veterinary workforce, or are you happy with the status quo? So George.
Yes, and I might in a moment ask Ian Hewett to come in you can talk vet to vet on this. But in general terms, one of the concerns we had coming up to the end of the transition period is, do we have enough vets? Is there enough capacity? It was one of our, for obvious reasons, something we wanted to make sure we got right. And in the end, that's not been a problem that's presented itself. So during the course of the last year, to the second half of last year, we trained around 1,400 vets to become official vets for the purposes of doing export health certificates. There was fairly even spread of that around the country. We had a similar scheme for local authorities so that they could train environmental health officers to be able to do fisheries certificates for EHCs as well. As a belt and braces, we took the precaution of training the majority of our state vets working for APHA to also be able to do this so that we had surge capacity. So we trained, I think, around 150 of our APHA vets also to be able to do this, so that if we had pressure points or gaps in certain parts of the country, we would have a sort of flying squad of DEFRA vets that we could throw at the situation to make sure that things were kept moving. In the event that surge capacity has not been needed, I think there were, in the first week, maybe just a couple of calls on that from a couple of local authorities, but they weren't needed thereafter. So that suggests to me that since we've not needed to dip into that surge capacity, the one we've had issues to deal with around paperwork and teething problems and people getting used to these new administrative processes, but the capacity's not been the issue. I think if there's been an issue, it links to what I said earlier. We trained lots of people, 1,400 new people to do this, but as we all know in life, there's a difference between being trained to do something and being experienced in doing something. So something we had to do in the first couple of months is we set up a group, if you like, of experienced export health certifiers and put them in a sort of dedicated position to help provide mentoring and support to that cohort of newly trained EHC, so that where there was a really technical problem or a technical question about what certificate you should use for langoustine or wild caught salmon and so on, that there was a technical expert who could assist, get them through that situation. But Ian, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Thank you, Secretary. So just a couple of quick points. So obviously there was the additional official veterinarians and certified support officers, which was a new function that was established, and there was quite a lot of take up for that, as the Secretary said, and that's continued into this year. There was the APHA staff that work under me, vets and animal health officers who could have stood in as certified support officers as in the private sector. I'm not a vet myself, but obviously I've got 250 or so in my team. And there was a bit in the middle, which was we hired some locum vets as in a first call on surge capacity. Very limited, as Secretary of State said, very limited demand for them. But we did try and position them into specific locations. So a couple into a fish hub. We used a couple on that dedicated line to help with the newly qualified OVs. And then one final point is what we've learnt from the first couple of months of exports and through virtually daily calls that David's team have overseen with certifying providers. We've updated the notes for official veterinarians acting as certifiers on a weekly and sometimes more frequent basis, just to make sure that they've got all of that information. So we had that AFA team of vets and animal health officers as a last resort. They got a little bit of use, but we haven't seen that any surge in demand. Thank you.
Can I just add very quickly? I think to summarise, there's enough capacity in the system. That's pretty clear because nobody wanted to use our surge capacity over the last few weeks. We've got to watch it very closely. We've said we want demand to pick up. For example, as groupage solutions are found for Europe as we come out of lockdown in France and other countries. So there will be increased demand. On the other hand, there will be increasing capacity because vets are getting better and doing export health certification with less time and less resource. So we're watching it very closely. We can always stand up the surge capacity again if we need to, and we will do that. FSA is looking for additional vets. We've just got agreement with the chief vet and RCVS to bring in some vets from other countries under a special dispensation to work in slaughterhouses. This is not for export health certificates, but it's part of the system.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, Chair, I will come back at question 10 to ask more about how some of the support officers can help vets. But that's really encouraging to sort of hear. Could I just ask, maybe coming back to Secretary of State and possibly Ian and David, your thoughts about, you say that there is the capacity there and you're increasing the workforce. So the Northern Irish model of having a larger dedicated veterinary workforce, you feel that the English model, you're happy with that compared to the Northern Irish model, are you?
I think you've got to choose one or the other. And you can either have a public sector capacity to sign export health certificates, or you can have a market. I don't think you can really do both.
Okay.
We've got a market and it's working well. But we can't always buttress it, which is what we've done with the surge capacity.
Thank you. Just as a quick follow-up to Secretary of State and I guess David and Ian as well. So I'm encouraged that you've got the surge capacity there. You've got, and George, I did like your analogy of the flying squad vets that could come in if need be. On a parallel issue, do we feel as a country, heaven forbid if we have an infectious disease outbreak in the animal population, do we have that surge capacity of vets that could actually tackle that in terms of disease surveillance and control? So we've been talking about exports and certification and that side of things. So this flying squad analogy, do you feel confident that, heaven forbid, if something came in like foot and mouth, we have the capacity, the veterinary capacity to stand up?
Well, and again, I may ask Ian to come in, but every few years we run an exercise, within DEFRA to test our readiness and preparedness for such eventualities. So an exotic animal disease outbreak. And so we've run exercises before on African swine fever. And I think I'm right in saying that every 4 years we have a convention that we run that exercise on a hypothetical FMD outbreak, since it's always very high up our risk list. I think the answer is yes. If there were, heaven forbid, an FMD outbreak, then yes, the protocols that we've got established and that we test regularly would swing into action. And we've the state vets that we've got and all the other support staff and all of the crucially trading standard staff in local authorities and so on would have a role to play in that. It was something that in a sort of doomsday scenario, as we were planning the end of the transition period, we did explore something that we called contiguous or concurrent risks, which would be what happened if at the same time we had a major flood incident or animal health outbreak, so it was something that we tested and worked through. I mean, there's always a problem with foot and mouth diseases, and obviously you never want there to be an outbreak. The longer you go without having a major outbreak like that, you get a decay in institutional memory, and that the vets that were around who dealt with that 2001 scenario have largely now retired. We do have ways of making sure that that knowledge is passed on to the next generation, and that we regularly stress test what we're doing. But you know, there's always that problem of facing a challenge again, sort of 20 years on, that you've got a new cohort of people that have not been tested in battle before and are therefore on a steep learning curve. So we do everything we can to be prepared for those types of outbreaks, regularly testing it. But yeah,
I think Neil, we better leave that one there because time's going on. So thank you, Secretary of State. Yeah, thank you, Neil. Just Derek Thomas now, question number 7. Derek, please.
Thank you, Secretary of State and DEFRA officials. So moving on, in terms of the hub, I think, George, you've described the hubs as a model particularly to support small, medium-sized businesses to export. We obviously heard examples of that in previous sessions. Do you, I guess that's your position, what role has DEFRA got in supporting the development of hubs?
So we are working with the industry on this. DFDS, which is the largest distributor in the fisheries sector, have got a number of hubs, I think, in Scotland, and I think there's one now in Grimsby that they operate as well. There's also one that DEFRA's been involved in the Rye area in Kent, which covers quite a lot of the producers along the south coast. And we've also, you know, there are discussions as well, you know, with the West Country and with some of the producers down there to see whether, you know, a distribution hub might actually be helpful for producers at that end of the country as well. And then in parallel with that, we've also agreed sort of new protocols on groupage. That is where you might get several consignments on a single load with the European Union, so that there's a clear understanding now that you can have a pallet of fish that is wrapped and sealed in a particular way, and that can go on a lorry with it being sequentially loaded with several other pallets, and those can be treated as separate consignments, but on a groupage model. So we've worked to make the groupage system work in a more predictable way, and I think we've perfected that now, and that's probably the approach still used predominantly for fish coming from the West Country. We've established a number of hubs, but we hope to do others as well, and including in the southwest.
Thanks. Is role of DEFRA, is it largely a commercial solution where actually the industry itself needs to come together and deliver this, or is there something that DEFRA has already done that is, if you like, what kind of concrete action has DEFRA done to make this a reality? Is it largely that you're encouraging that and that the industry needs to sort itself out?
Yeah, I mean, our role really is a facilitating role. So getting groups together, offering support where we can, but in the final analysis, generally, it needs either a major distributor like DFDS or perhaps a sort of joint venture between a collection of some of the larger exporters in somewhere like the southwest, you know, to come together, agree on a physical site where this could be done, and then to you know, to put in place the processes they need for that redistribution from the hub.
Let's be clear though, we are a very proactive facilitator. So if you take the groupage solution that the Secretary of State just described, we have made that happen. We designed it, we brought the parties together, the logistics companies, the authorities in Northern Ireland, the exporters, we put them all together, and I think it's fair to say without us it wouldn't have happened, but it needs everybody to play the part, and there is a strong commercial incentive there. It doesn't need our money. It needs us to bring the technical expertise and the coordination.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Secretary of State. So in kind of the near future, do you see that the vast majority of small, medium-sized businesses will be exporting that way? And is there a risk then that we might have a number of very big businesses that have hubs around the country that ultimately create another layer between the small exporter and the customer itself? Is there a concern of that actually it becomes a very kind of top-heavy kind of process for exporting fish?
I think what I'd say is it depends on the choice that they make. So some very small exporters doing small consignments, might choose to do what I'd call consolidation, which is to allow an agent or another company to manage the export process for them, and not actually directly export themselves. But if it were through a hub, then they remain the individual exporter. Right. And the hub is really a facilitation process by the haulage company and the distributor. So in the case of DFDS, what they actually do is it's a distribution hub. Fish arrives, it's got a dispatch note, a particular destination, a particular customer. But when they load all of that on the lorry, they have a single export health certificate that covers maybe multiple consignments on that lorry. And it enables them to remove the need for maybe 4 or 5 certificates on a lorry to having a single certificate. And they still need some sort of health attestation data to come from the exporting business, but it does enable them to consolidate loads onto a single EHC.
No, thank you. It does certainly seem a sensible approach. Thank you, Chair. That's all I have. Thank you. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Derek. Just one last supplementary from me, Secretary of State. I mean, I think the point that Derek makes is a good one. I think we've got to be careful that the big boys don't gobble up the little boys and girls, really, because, they will, the more you have the sort of centralization, and the hubs are a good idea, but you have got to allow access to these small producers and exporters, because otherwise they just won't do it, will they? They just give up on the whole operation. And also, we don't want those running the hubs maybe doing a good job, but if they start charging too much for the service, you see, again, it becomes uneconomic for the smaller producer. So, I mean, are you looking at that? Because I think it could become a real issue if we're not careful.
Yes, we are very much looking at that. It's why trying to make the hub model work and have more hubs in different parts of the country, I think is going to be quite important to allowing those smaller exporters to keep exporting in the way they have in the past. And where they've got established customers and relationships, obviously we want to be able to support that and do everything we can to design systems that work in this new world.
Okay, I'm glad you're really aware of it and bearing down on that. Right, thank you, Derek. So now over to Robbie, please. Question number 8. Robbie, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and good to see you, Secretary of State. My question is talking about the revised timetable for the introduction of SBS controls on EU imports to GB. Can I start just by asking you why were EU member states ready to impose controls and checks on SBS exports from GB on the 1st of January when we were not?
It's less that we chose not to do it in that way, I think is the way I would put it. So we made a decision last June or July that actually, given that there were uncertainties about how ready people would be, and given that there were some uncertainties about how things would flow at the border from day one, that we should phase things in. And so we should require from the beginning a very light touch approach on customs declaration, which is what we've had in place, that we should not introduce documentary checks for export health certificates from day one, but we decided we would do that from April, and that we shouldn't actually start physical checks until a few months after that. So we took a conscious decision because we thought it made sense that as you depart from the single market and the customs union, you should gradually allow people to acclimatise themselves to the changes. And we did so to be reasonable and pragmatic, recognising that there wasn't really a risk in food safety in doing so. The European Union, for reasons that are best known to the European Union, chose not to be reasonable and pragmatic in a reciprocal way. And you then get into the question, do you do a tit for tat? And I think then the question becomes, is the purpose of border checks and EHCs a sort of trade retaliation mechanism, or is it actually there for a genuine purpose, which is to ensure the safety of our food and ensure that taxes are paid where they're due? And we chose to take the view that it's the latter, and that's why we believed in the phased approach.
Okay, so and then obviously there was the announcements of the revised timetables and things. I just want to come on to that. But does the fact that EU imports that face no SPS checks place British seafood and meat businesses at a competitive disadvantage?
Well, it obviously, I can see from those businesses, of course, it will be galling to see that importers bringing produce in from the European Union don't yet have to complete the same sort of paperwork that exporters do. So is there a difference? Yes, yes, there is, but it is going to be a short-term difference because we will be requiring those documentary checks and export health certificates, obviously in due course. And we will also then be, after that, phasing in physical checks as well.
Chairman, may I just read just a quote that we received from the National Pig Association and just ask you to respond on that, if it's okay, Secretary of State. They said that they were concerned about the delay, that it perpetuates an imbalance between imports and exports, giving the EU companies a competitive advantage, and went on to add that if EU imports can be, if EU products can be imported without checks and therefore at a lower cost, it ultimately impacts the price British farmers will receive for their pigs. Could you comment on that, if that'd be okay?
Well, I think the context of this is that the pig sector, is going through a difficult phase at the moment, partly because there is a bit of oversupply across Europe, mainly though because of severe disruption of the market in China, where they have placed restriction on German exports due to African swine fever, and where they've placed restriction on British exports due to coronavirus outbreaks at certain plants. And so the principal cause of the problems that they have at the moment really stem from decisions that China is taking. We're trying to work through that. But of course, when you have an industry that's going through a difficult time, people will pick up on issues like this and, highlight what they would perceive as an unfairness. And I understand that. But I come back to what I said, it's going to be short-lived because we will be requiring those reciprocal checks on imports of pork from countries like Denmark and the Netherlands and Germany and so on. They will be put in place. It's just we've delayed it a little bit further.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. Thank you very much. Cheryl now, please. Question number 9, Cheryl, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And Mr. Hewett, I feel that we've perhaps not given you that many questions today. So this question is directed to you, if that's okay with you, Secretary of State. Mr. Hewett, what are the risks to food safety of delaying the introduction of checks on food imports from the EU?
Thank you. And obviously, I'm sure Secretary of State or David Kennedy may wish to add. But first point to make is we are undertaking checks on live animals and on high-risk plants for planting at points of destination until such time as checks are undertaken at border control points once established. So from a biosecurity perspective, those checks are in place and will continue to be monitored. We're currently servicing something like 3,700 points of destination for high-risk plants. And obviously, a point of destination for a live animal tends to be a farm, and we will monitor that. And there have been some interceptions as a result. So in terms of key risks, we think we've got that covered off. Obviously, over time, as Secretary of State has already said, there will be an introduction of documentary checks to be followed by physical checks at the ports once established.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, did you want to add anything? I do apologise for going to Mr. Hewett first. But...
No, I'm happy to have a break. The only thing I would add is look at the moment the regulations that the EU have on everything from pesticides right through to SBS requirements in slaughterhouses. They are fully in line with British law, and that's because we've only just left, and we had regulatory alignment until the end of the transition period. We've not been rushing to change those particular regulations at the moment. The EU's made some minor changes, but not in a way that causes us any concern. So goods coming from the European Union fundamentally don't pose any more threat today than they did 3 months ago. And so for that reason, we don't think there's a risk to public health. I mean, there is a much smaller issue, which is goods that come from outside the European Union but are in transit. Those will sometimes have a full check by the EU and a documentary check. Sometimes they will have a documentary check at the point of entry, and when they come into the UK under our law, they have to go to a BCP now to be checked. So there's we've got provisions in place for those transit goods as well, but we don't judge there's a particular risk for goods coming from the European Union.
Okay, and if you do in the future perceive that there are risks, do you have any plans in place that you can implement immediately to address them?
Yes, I mean, if we, the more likely, issue is that as we start doing checks, you may start to see that there are certain products that are more of a risk, or where there are particular issues coming from particular regions. Also, one of the key freedoms we have now outside the European Union is if we wanted to take tougher action on biosecurity, for instance, to prevent Xylella from getting into the UK, we've got the freedom to do those sorts of restrictions now, either regionally or to the whole of the European Union. So there will, over time, undoubtedly be things that we do to protect biosecurity that may start to put some restrictions on some EU goods coming into the UK.
And if I could just finish, Chairman, with one last question. Checks on EU seafood and meat imports are currently being undertaken at the point of destination on a risk-led basis. How many such checks have been conducted to date?
Well, on imports, I don't think we're doing checks, but Ian might want to come in. So on imported goods,
if you don't have the information readily available, I'd appreciate it if you could perhaps write to the committee fairly soon with that information.
So just to be clear, they don't need to be checked. So there aren't any checks on meat or fish coming from the EU at the moment. They will come in now on the new schedule, which is next January. I think what Ian referred to was we do check high-risk plants that are coming in, and we can give you the data for the checks that we've done at the points of destination, and we do check live animals and their points of destination of farms. So we can give you that data, but it's the food at the moment is not checked because the biosecurity risk actually is no higher than it was before the end of the implementation period. That will change over time, and we will have the checks to protect against that.
So to be clear, at the moment, the EU are conducting checks on our exports, but we aren't conducting any checks on imports, and we don't think that's necessary.
We think for the interim period, it does not pose an increased biosecurity risk. We think over time, it is necessary to have those checks as our regimes diverge. So for the interim, it doesn't pose a biosecurity risk. So
can you just explain to me, just very quickly, why we are perceiving those risks in a different way to the European Union?
Well, I think the short answer is the European Union's not looking at risk, it's just looking at its rule book. put bluntly, the checks that the EU are carrying out on British exports are entirely futile. In that the products we have are as safe now as they were 3 months ago when they were able to travel without any paperwork. We've chosen to recognise that and be pragmatic in the way we've phased in checks. The European Union haven't really approached this on a risk-based approach. They've simply said EU law is what it is, and so we were required to do this, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, so it's a legalistic approach that treats us like every other third country, and with no flexibility and not risk-based.
So it's the rigid EU system that we've escaped from that they are using against us. And that's
arguably we've not entirely escaped it, because we now have to fill out the paperwork to access the market.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cheryl. Just before we leave this one, Secretary of State, you mentioned sort of diseases, because in the future you've got blue tongue in cattle, you've got porcine epidemic, diarrhea, you've got equine influenza. So are you looking to sort of tighten up on the controls of that to make sure we're not importing anything that's diseased in the future? Because I think, it's time that we woke up, smelt the coffee, and actually did something about potential diseases coming in from the EU, because they would be fast enough to do it the other way around. So, I really am interested in us upping the game, shall we say, on disease control. So can you give me those reassurances?
Yes, I mean, obviously we focus today predominantly on a lot of the extra administration, but it's important that we understand and step back and question why we've chosen to leave the European Union and leave the single market, because we want the freedom to, design our own systems in future. And in this area, that will include having our own independent policy on biosecurity. It will make it easier where we choose to put regional restrictions on certain goods, where we think there's a prevalence of certain animal or plant diseases. It will mean as well that we can move to a much more modern risk-based approach to border checks in the round. So rather than just having percentages of checks that are prescribed in law, which is what the EU system is, a much more dynamic approach where you identify emerging risks in real time and focus your energies to try to intercept particular problems from wherever they might come in the world. It's a great opportunity to have a much more modern, much more versatile system than that which we've been used to in the European Union.
Yeah, thank you. So much more on a sort of risk basis, we would do the checking. That's what you're saying, is it?
Yes, I mean, so the great flaw really in the EU system is, as David Kennedy says, it currently now treats us the same as it would any other third country in the world, when clearly that's just not justified on any kind of risk-based assessment. And so it means that they're spending a lot of time checking British exports when actually they probably should be spending a bit more time checking exports coming from other parts of the world. But because they don't have any kind of risk-based model, it's very much just prescribed percentages in EU law. That is the system they just follow.
You probably don't want to answer this question, but do you also think it could be a little bit politically based, the fact that they want to make it difficult for us because we've left the European Union? You probably don't want to answer that question, but there is a lot of feeling that they are being particularly difficult because we have left, and they want to teach us, in their view, a lesson. But you probably don't necessarily want to answer that question, do you, Secretary of State?
Well, I don't really want to speculate, on that. I think, I think, rather than want to make it difficult, I think they've never wanted to make it particularly easy for obviously a country to leave the European Union. But we all very much hope that obviously we can, now that there is a trade and cooperation agreement, and it's been a difficult process for everyone over the last few years, but now that's been agreed, very important really that we try to get back into a sensible bilateral relationship. We are near neighbours, we do huge amounts of trade with one another, and we very much hope to and look forward to seeing a return to normal relations.
Right. So you in answer to Barry Gardner earlier on, you said the TCA was a little while before the Europeans are going to ratify it, and we've already ratified our side of the bargain. So when do you believe that they're going to be in a position to honour the agreements that we have with them?
Well, I think I'm right saying that initially they had hoped to be able to, ratify by the end of March. I think for various internal reasons and problems that they've got in terms of keeping that work on track, that slipped. It's possible they may seek to ratify by the end of April, but it's a little unclear. I think they've had some difficulties at their end, and obviously a lot of other distractions with challenges on other fronts.
Interesting how they can get all the restrictions and the trade inspections in place, but they can't get that legislation done. But I'll leave it there for now. So Neil, now question number 10, Neil, please. Neil Hudson, are you still there?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm still there. Thank you. And thank you for those answers about and the question, Chair, about disease surveillance and our readiness as well. And it is reassuring to know that DEFRA does, take this very, very seriously and looking to the future as well. I speak as someone who did spend a period during foot and mouth as a temporary veterinary inspector. So it's reassuring that we are, ready to sort of step up, because there are, as the Chair has said, there are threats, African horse sickness and various other diseases that we need to be ready for. But in terms of that, and we've talked about cooperation with the EU, and vets work very closely across the boundaries as well. But is the government actively seeking a bespoke veterinary agreement with the EU, or just although the UK can now design their own policies, but is the government seeking a bespoke veterinary agreement?
Yes, I think in reality, particularly given some of the tensions over the Northern Ireland Protocol, the EU currently aren't in the right kind of space to want to have such a dialogue. But I think once we get to the point that they've ratified the TCA and the specialised committees have been set up, I think through that it would be possible to design better processes that will be mutually beneficial. And as David Kennedy said earlier, there's an openness on their part to making sure that our import system, our IPAF system, and their traces system are able to work together properly. They do have a veterinary partnership agreement, for instance, with New Zealand, and on the basis of that, they have lower levels of checks. So it is in one level slightly extraordinary that they check us more than they check New Zealand, even though we've got identical laws. So I think it may well be possible to, develop certain approaches and recognition of equivalence in both directions, and over time, to put in place sensible, pragmatic, easements. They do have this with other countries. Although we should also note that the volume of trade between New Zealand and the EU is very, very small. And obviously we got a much higher volume of trade, so that the type of agreement you'd seek, might be quite different. The final thing I'd say is, even though there's no formal provisions in place, Christine Middlemiss, our Chief Veterinary Officer, has got very good relations with her opposite numbers in EU member states. So later this week, she's going to be meeting her opposite number in Poland to discuss some of the issues there's been there with salmonella in poultry, for instance. So at a technical working level, between our veterinary service and that of member states, there's still very, very positive technical dialogue that takes place.
That's really encouraging to hear. I mean, so do you feel that moving forward, so perhaps the differences between us are not as great as some people from the outside might say? As you say, the vets are working together. Disease does not respect international borders. But you feel that does the EU's position, does it need to move a lot before we could have some agreement, or do you think it's actually closer than we think already?
I think the reality is that I don't think everybody's very obviously preoccupied with the huge sort of coronavirus pandemic and all of the challenges that faces. I think that once we can all get beyond that, and once they've ratified the TCA, I think it's absolutely possible that there'll be a thawing in relations. Things will settle down into a regular routine, and that from that position we'll be able to, build out sensible, pragmatic arrangements that make sense for both parties.
Thank you. And following up, then my sort of supplementary for that is, if we do want the same thing, where do you feel, Secretary of State, is the right balance for the industry between being us able to set our own SPS standards with having a form of equivalence with the EU that actually helps producers on both sides of the channel in terms of the movement of their products? Where do we? There is a bit of a tension there, but there should be a balance that could be struck, surely.
Yes, well, I think if you step back and ask what is the rationale of an export health certificate, it is to give reassurance to the receiving country that the goods that are arriving, satisfy or are equivalent to the standards that you would require in your home country when it comes to biosecurity and food safety. And therefore, the closer your regulatory regimes are, the easier it is to recognise equivalence, the easier it is to make that export health certification that will be required in both directions as simple as possible. The greater you diverge, the more information there might need to be on that export health certificate to give confidence to the receiving country that they can be assured of the quality of the goods that are arriving. And if you look at it in that vein, we ought to be able to simplify some of these processes, but it does require a willingness to engage on both fronts, and I think that will take a little bit of time for all the reasons I've said.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Chair, that leads me on to my sort of final question in question 10 then, in terms of simplifying things moving forward. And we've talked a lot about veterinary capacity and vets having to be the ultimate signing off on many of these certificates. I mean, what discussions have you had with the EU to allow some of the certifying officers to actually electronically sign and stamp EHCs for these exports to the EU to actually smooth that? Or does that still have to come through the vets in the end?
It still requires a vet in the case of products of animal origin, particularly from the meat processors, and that is, I think, written down in EU law. And so one of the issues is, not only the requirement for a fully qualified vet, but also the actual design of the export health certificates is, I think, set out in a schedule of an EU regulation. So it requires a legislative change for them to adjust some of these processes should they want to. There is a case probably for some of these roles potentially being able to be carried out by a paraprofessional who's not a fully qualified vet but is an expert in the field. But at the moment, it's not something that's provided for in EU law. And obviously, as an exporter, we have to provide what they request on their certificate.
But at this point, you've not had discussions along those lines, because it is a safeguard, isn't it, to ultimately have a vet signing it off. But at this point in time, you're not actively seeking those discussions.
Well, I think I don't know whether David wants to come in to see whether we did explore this. Certainly, what the law already provides for is that while a vet has to sign off a certificate, there are certain elements in the of the work leading up to that can be carried out by a support officer. So there is we are exploring the role of certifying support officers who might not be fully qualified vets, but you would still need a vet to sign off the EHC at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, Neil, you done?
Yeah. Unless David wanted to come in there or not.
Yeah, just to say that there is a significant role for the support officers. I think it's going to be very hard to persuade the EU that you don't have to have a vet signing the certificate. So we've asked the question, for example, is the really important work of the vet upstream with the attestation, and could you automate everything from there on? Probably it is going to need a vet in that process downstream. And the challenge then is minimize the work for that vet to do, make sure they've got all the data that they need that comes through automated systems, and then we're going to take that red tape we keep talking about out of the system. That's the big prize for us.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, David, for that. Right, okay, Barry Gardner, you would like a question now, Barry. Can you try and keep them fairly short, please? So over to you, Barry, please.
Very grateful to you, Chair. Secretary of State, you said earlier that you had relied upon the September 2019 correspondence with the EU, and that it was they who gave the EU the form to the UK the form to use. But we heard in a previous session that in fact the chief vet who initiated that correspondence specifically asked about animal health regulations and a particular form of bivalves not destined for deputation and on into the food chain, but in fact those for other non-food use. Sarah Horsfall from the Shellfish Association of GB told the inquiry that if they had seen the correspondence at the time, they would have been able to spot that mistake, but that the whole mess started because in effect the chief veterinary officer asked the wrong question. She asked it about the part of the regulation that relates to ornamental purposes. Is that not correct?
Well, I saw the correspondence and we published it, so I don't think that's correct. So we were looking specifically at the issue of bivalve mollusks, and we asked my understanding from the correspondence that I haven't seen admittedly for a month or so, but I think it was in September 2019, we asked for guidance or clarification of our interpretation around live bivalve mollusks, and the EU confirmed that the model animal health certificate for import to the EU of aquaculture animals for relaying to fisheries would be the appropriate certificate to use for aquaculture.
All of that I think is correct, but the statement that or the imputation certainly that Sarah Horsfall made was that they'd asked all of that under the wrong regulation, and that was why they got the answer that they got. I wonder if perhaps you could just check that and then maybe write to the committee to clarify precisely why you don't think it was the wrong regulation.
Yes, I think what Sarah Horsfall might be referring to is that that initial dialogue was under an animal health regulation, yes, since it was an import of an animal not for direct human consumption but for depuration. The claim that the EU made then on the 3rd of February was that a separate public health regulation meant that these couldn't be imported. Although, again, because it wasn't a product for direct human consumption, it's a bit like saying, you can't import a live sheep because people don't want to eat live sheep or shouldn't eat live sheep. Of course they shouldn't, and that's not what would happen. So I think to the EU, we made this mistake in trying to then rely on a public health regulation that wasn't appropriate. And my recollection is that itself, also made provision read alongside the animal health regulation for these goods to be sold for depuration.
Well, if you could just write to the committee and set out clearly why you think that Sarah Horsfall was incorrect in her understanding of the regulation under which the Chief Veterinary Officer had asked the initial question. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, we'll do that.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. Right, Secretary of State, we're on to question 11, which a lot of it we've sort of covered along the way. And what I want to put to you really is that two wrongs don't make a right, and I accept that. But there is an issue now that we are finding, the EU is basically not only have their rules, but I think throwing the rule book at us as we export into the EU. We're being very pragmatic. We're allowing things through into the UK from the EU, and that's giving them an advantage at the moment. Now, is there a chance that by January we could offer them an electronic system of health certificates, the whole lot being done in a very streamlined fashion, and if we could we not actually sort of offer that to them and say, could that not be possible that you reciprocate and we have the same when we go back? Because I do feel, we are missing a real opportunity here to negotiate with the EU and say, right, you have now got to come through to us. Now, if they won't negotiate with us, then I think we should start, really being quite difficult, checking lots of lorries, making it very slow for them to come through, because, that's what they've been doing to us. Let's be blunt about it. So, what situation is, are you ready by January with a good electronic system so we can get rid of lots of paperwork, let the food through from the EU, do it in a very streamlined fashion, and then say to them, right, EU, we've done a good job here in helping you. Will you help us? Are you going to be in that position to offer them at that stage?
Well, and I might ask David to come in. So one of the things to note is, in the context of Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol, we've been actually doing quite a lot of detailed thinking around more digital solutions. Solutions that mean data and health attestations can follow consignments of food through the supply chain in order to simplify processes. So we're doing quite a lot of work in this kind of area, really to make the Northern Ireland Protocol work well. And if, as I think, we perfect that and we're able to demonstrate how well that can work, then of course, if there were an appetite for engagement on this from the European Union, some of those are principles that could also be applied, more widely in terms of UK, EU trade. But it will require them to want to be in the frame of mind to have that kind of discussion. Now that is possible, but it's not something that's possible at the moment. But in answer to your question, are we working up better processes that would work well for both parties? The answer is yes, very much so in the context of Northern Ireland, and some of that work would could have wider applications if there was an appetite to apply it wider.
Yeah, sorry, David, before you come in, I mean, if we look at this sort of logically, and you take the politics out of it and look at the trade situation, if you take the trade, overall EU trade, that wouldn't just be with food, but if you take the overall, we have a big deficit with the EU on trade, and so therefore they are actually exporting more to us overall than we are exporting to them. So surely, pragmatically, there is a good argument to be said in order to facilitate good trade between Britain and the EU, which is that we are a major trading partner of the EU as well as they are of us. And so why on earth can't they see why can't we instill a little pragmatism into the EU? Man, I must admit I had 10 years in the European Parliament, didn't see much sign of pragmatism in the Commission then, and I see less even now. But David, I know what can we do to sort of stimulate, take the politics out and the fact that we've left and we must be punished and all this rubbish? We got to trade, we got to get on with life. You're a civil servant, you sort it out, please. Over to you, David.
Right, let's give you a quick example. So I have a weekly meeting with my counterparts in Dublin. As we introduce requirements for export health certificates, pre-notification and checks, increasingly they will want to be in discussions with us about easements and process simplification. So I think there is a discussion to have. We are working on our side with industry. So over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I've got my teams having various industry workshops to come up with, what are the 10 things that we want to simplify in terms of export health certificates. That will form the basis for the discussion. So I think the coming together of, we need to frame what our ask is, first of all. Then we need the treaty to be ratified and the SPS committee to be set up where we can discuss these things. We need the checks coming in on our side. So there is a strong interest on the European side to work with us on easements that are of mutual benefit. And then I think there's a lot we can do potentially.
Right, so that's an issue, isn't it? Putting it back to January, we have sort of missed an opportunity, but I don't think there's any point in going on and on about that. But on this question, David, of will we be ready with a slick system that can be done electronically rather than so paper-based, or will we still be not ready with that by the time we get to January? Where are we going to be?
No, it should be this year. So in principle, we had a very good discussion last week with the Commission on the interface between ECHO, so our export system, and Traces NT, which is their import system, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, but it will be useful for all of Europe, as the Secretary of State said. We are having a discussion about the vice versa. So for them to interface Trace as their export system with IPAF's our import system, those discussions are ongoing. We are doing the technical work as well. So it is feasible that by the end of the year, we can have these interfaces working. They're challenging, but they are doable if the political will is there. But as I say, we've had the right signals.
Right, I look forward to inviting you back on the 1st of January to check that all these processes are in place. But,
right.
but no, you can't be held entirely responsible. 2nd of January, right. You can't be held responsible for everything, I accept that. But no, I think, I make a serious point. I think, we, and I'm sure you are aware of it, as everybody is, to work hard to try and make this work for both sides. Now, Secretary of State, just before you leave, I have a couple of follow-up questions. One is from Anthony Magnu, which is about, this is going back to the testing of water for the export of shellfish. And he's saying that it sort of takes around 12 hours to get the water tested. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. Can we actually speed up and have a much more rapid test? Is that possible? Are you looking into that?
This is a test on what? Just
yeah, on the waters, when you're exporting the fish, to check what the actual I suppose, is it on the fish or on the water? I don't know. I think it's probably on the water, I think.
I can help. I think it's the classification, and I think possibly the Environment Agency do it.
Yeah.
Yes. This is about the Class A and Class B.
It's an impedance test, it's called. Currently takes around 12 hours. And he's saying, can that be speeded up?
I think unless Ian has the answer to that, because I think it's an FSA lead or possibly CFAS if it's an issue around algal blooms. But if I could, perhaps we should write to the committee on that.
Okay, that would be good if you could, please. I'm sorry to bounce that one on you. And then the final one is, I raised this with the Chancellor, and it's probably more the Chancellor than anybody else, but if you actually refurbish an older fishing boat, and if you're a company, you get 18% capital allowance per year on that boat depreciation. If you buy a new boat, you get a 6% relief, you see. So there is an argument that we should actually put it up to a higher, capital relief on newer boats, so that we can add to the safety at sea, to the less pollution, all of these things that are better for the fishermen. So would you be keen to support this idea? And it would also sort of build up the fishing industry. I think also a lot of these boats are made in the north of England, so it would actually give some employ to the north of England as well. So I don't know whether you've considered, I know probably it's not your role as Secretary of State but it would be one way of really stimulating some new boats in the fishing industry, really.
Yeah, well, I have heard this raised before. I think in fact Cheryl Murray may have raised this issue previously with me, alongside accessibility for grants, where currently you can only get a grant for a smaller engine if you're rekitting a vessel. I think what I'll say is these are I'm going to be say the usual form of words. It's ultimately a Treasury decision. It'll be a matter for the Chancellor, but I'm happy to look at that proposal and give it some consideration.
Yeah, because I think it's all about, stimulating the fishing industry. We actually want this to be a positive effect in the long run. And I believe there will be some positive aspects to fisheries in the long run. We've got, real problems at the moment through the, export and the licenses and everything we've been talking about today. But before you go, can I thank, you and David and Ian and the department, for working very hard on this, because I know you are working very hard on it. I think it must be very frustrating. I think you've been very diplomatic about the EU. I dare say a lot more diplomatic about the EU than I might be if I was sitting in your seat. But, you know, we do have to sort this, because in the end, we need to get trade freely flowing, and it's in both interests. It's in the interest of the UK, but it's also in the interest of Europe to make it work into the future. So we thank you we put you through, you know, a fair pasting today. Thank you very much for your answers, and it will be good evidence for us, you know, to put our report finally together, because, you know, we want the shellfish to survive and prosper. We want our fishing fleet to increase in the long run. We want to get more exports across to the EU, and let's hope that after COVID and a lot of those European restaurants open up, the greater demand for fish will help to sort of drive demand for our fish over here, and the markets will rise. And I suspect it'll be quite interesting when they need more fish. I've got a feeling that the borders may not be quite so difficult to get through in Europe as they are at the moment, but we'll better wait and see on that one. So thank you, Secretary of State. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ian. And thank you very much to members this afternoon for a very good meeting. So thank you all.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended.